It was just another regular day at school. The halls echoed with chatter, students rushing to their classes, and teachers preparing lessons. But for one girl, this day was about to change everything. Lena was just 12 years old, with a big smile and a personality that could light up a room. She was known for her kindness, her energy, and her sharp wit. But on this day, none of that seemed to matter. Lena arrived at school with excitement in her step, her backpack heavy with the promise of new knowledge. But when she walked into her classroom, things didn't go as expected. Her teacher, Mrs. Williams, an older woman who had taught at the school for over 20 years, noticed something unusual. Lena was wearing a beautiful dress, but something was missing. The girl had no pants on, just a dress and bare legs. Now, to many, it might have seemed like a simple mistake. Maybe Lena had just forgotten her pants. But Mrs. Williams, feeling the need to act immediately, decided to send the young girl home. She couldn't let this slide. What would the other teachers think? What would the other students say? So, she did what she thought was the right thing. Lena was sent home. It wasn't until later that Mrs. Williams realized the enormity of her decision and how much trouble she had just invited into her life. But what Mrs. Williams didn't know was that Lena's family wasn't just any family. Lena's father, an influential man with a powerful presence in the community, wasn't someone you would want to upset. Especially not for something as trivial as a misunderstanding. The moment the school found out who Lena's father was, everything changed. Mrs. Williams went from being a trusted teacher to someone who was suddenly questioning her career, her choices, and her very understanding of what she thought she knew. But what exactly happened next? How did this simple mistake spiral out of control? And how did one teacher's regret lead to a whirlwind that no one saw coming? Stay tuned as we dive deeper into the story, unraveling the unexpected consequences that followed, and discovering just how much one decision can impact a life. As news of Lena being sent home without pants spread through the school, whispers began to form like an unstoppable storm. To the teachers, it was a simple case of a child making a mistake, an innocent mistake that anyone could have overlooked. But to some, the situation was much more than that. It became a symbol of how things could go wrong when the smallest of errors were made. Mrs. Williams had never been a strict teacher, but this incident sparked something within her. She found herself torn between the duty to maintain discipline and her own instincts, telling her she might have overreacted. Still, she tried to justify her decision, telling herself it was for the best. She didn't want to seem too lenient, especially not with a school full of students looking up to her for guidance. But deep down, doubt began to creep in. Lena, on the other hand, sat at home that afternoon, staring out the window as her mother tried to calm her down. She couldn't understand what had just happened. It wasn't like she meant to cause trouble. She'd woken up late that morning, in a rush, and when she grabbed her clothes, she didn't realize her pants were missing. She just threw on the first thing she could find. A mistake. Something that could happen to anyone. But it wasn't just any mistake. It was her mistake. And it was about to cost more than she could ever imagine. As she sat in silence, her mother's voice broke through her thoughts. "Don't worry, sweetheart. We'll sort this out." Her mother's calmness helped, but Lena could sense the underlying tension. The words she didn't speak filled the air. Words about the potential consequences, about the people they might have to deal with. Words that Lena didn't fully understand yet. Across town, things were unfolding very differently for Mrs. Williams. She was still sitting in her classroom, now alone after the students had gone home. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on her. How could she have missed something so simple? Why did she send Lena home, instead of just letting her return? To class? She kept running the moment over and over in her head. Every time she thought she'd made the right decision, a new thought would arise that shook her confidence. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how badly she had misjudged the situation. But it wasn't until the school principal called her later that day that everything started to fall apart. "Mrs. Williams, we need to have a serious talk about what happened today. I just got off the phone with Lena's father, and frankly, I'm concerned." The words made Mrs. Williams's stomach drop. Lena's father. That name was not one you heard lightly. Lena's father was a man of significant influence, an entrepreneur, a community leader, a man who didn't take lightly to anyone messing with his family. He had a reputation for being a strong protector of his daughter, and he had the means to make anyone who crossed him regret it. The news of his involvement was a shock to Mrs. Williams, who had no idea who she was dealing with when she sent Lena home. With the phone call still fresh in her mind, Mrs. Williams felt the weight of her actions. Her hands shook slightly as she gathered her things to leave. The principal's voice echoed in her ears. "This could go either way. We're in damage control mode now. You need to be prepared for the fallout." The words replayed like a haunting refrain, and Mrs. Williams couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to face consequences far greater than she ever imagined. At Lena's house, the situation was just as tense. Her father had already called the school. His voice was calm, but the threat in it was clear. "I expect a formal apology tomorrow," he had said. "And if this is not handled properly, we'll be taking legal action. My daughter is not someone you make a fool of." His reputation alone was enough to send chills down anyone's spine. The fact that Lena's father was now involved only made the situation feel even more out of control. As the evening wore on, Lena's mother sat with her, trying to offer comfort, but Lena could see the worry in her eyes. It wasn't just about the mistake anymore. It was about the storm brewing on the horizon. The next morning, as Lena prepared to return to school, the air seemed thick with tension. She was nervous, unsure of what to expect. What would her classmates say? How would her teacher react? She tried to push the thoughts from her mind, but they kept creeping back. At the school, Mrs. Williams couldn't shake the anxiety that had been building since the previous day. She had to face Lena's father in person, something she had been dreading. She had no idea how to apologize for her mistake, how to make this right. She couldn't even imagine how angry he must be. The thought of facing him sent a cold shiver down her spine. When Lena walked into the school that morning, her heart raced. The eyes of her classmates seemed to follow her every move. She could feel the weight of their stares. Some looked at her with pity, others with curiosity, and a few even seemed to whisper behind their hands. But it wasn't just the students that made her nervous. The moment she stepped into the classroom, Mrs. Williams's face, pale and tight with anxiety, met hers. "Lena," Mrs. Williams started, her voice soft but trembling slightly. Before she could finish, the door to the classroom opened, and there he was, Lena's father. His presence was impossible to ignore. He walked in with an air of authority, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Mrs. Williams. The room fell into a tense silence. "I believe we need to have a serious conversation," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of someone used to getting their way. Every word seemed to echo in the room, and Lena felt her stomach churn. This was it, the moment that everything had been leading to. The tension was unbearable. How would this meeting end? Would Mrs. Williams be able to apologize and make things right? Or would this small mistake tear apart the school, and perhaps even her career, in a way she never saw coming? The clock was ticking, and the consequences of what had happened were only just beginning to unfold. The room was thick with anticipation as Lena's father, Mr. Williams, stood in the doorway, his presence commanding attention. Mrs. Williams, visibly shaken, stood frozen, her hands trembling as she tried to compose herself. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but nothing had prepared her for the weight of it all. Mr. Williams didn't waste time. His gaze shifted to Lena, who was sitting nervously at her desk. "Lena, sweetheart, are you all right?" His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable edge to it, like a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. Lena nodded, trying her best to keep it together. She hadn't expected this confrontation to feel so personal, so close. She had always seen her father as this strong, untouchable figure, but now, in the face of this situation, she realized just how much her family's reputation was on the line. She didn't know whether to feel safe or terrified by her father's presence. Mrs. Williams, struggling to find the right words, finally spoke up. "Mr. Williams, I made a mistake," she began, her voice wavering. "I didn't mean to upset your daughter. It was just, I thought." Mr. Williams raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "I know what you thought," he said coolly, "but your actions were irresponsible, sending my daughter home like that, without a moment's thought to what it might do to her. You don't get to decide what's best for my family." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried authority in a way that made everyone in the room listen closely. Mrs. Williams looked down at the floor, guilt washing over her. She had assumed that the situation could be handled with a stern decision, but now, as she stood face to face with a man who commanded so much power, she realized just how out of her depth she truly was. She had never meant to cause harm, but in that moment, the weight of her actions hit her harder than she had expected. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I should have handled it differently. I didn't mean for it to escalate like this." Her apology hung in the air, but she knew deep down that words alone wouldn't fix what had already been broken. Lena's father turned his attention back to her. "We're leaving. You've been through enough already today. I don't want you to have to deal with this any longer." But just as they were about to leave, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Williams, still struggling to find the right way to make amends, took a deep breath and looked Mr. Williams in the eyes. "Please," she said, her voice steadier now, "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I do want to make it right. I'll do whatever it takes to restore the trust I've broken. I understand the damage I've caused, and I don't want Lena to suffer because of my mistake." There was a long pause. Mr. Williams didn't say anything for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. The tension in the room was palpable. Finally, he spoke. "I appreciate your apology," he said, his tone softer, but still firm. "But let me be clear. I don't want this to happen again. You have a responsibility to every student in your care, and I trust that you'll remember that going forward." Lena's heart raced as her father turned to her. "Let's go home, sweetheart. We're done here." He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, and as they walked out of the classroom, Lena couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. She wasn't sure if everything would be fully resolved, but she knew one thing for certain. This was a moment that would change things forever. As they walked out of the school, the weight on Lena's chest began to lift. The tension, the nerves, the uncertainty, it all started to fade. She wasn't sure if Mrs. Williams would ever be the same, but she was certain that she had learned a valuable lesson today. People make mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes are small, and sometimes they're big enough to change everything. But the important thing was to take responsibility, to acknowledge the harm caused, and to work towards making things right. Later that evening, after the dust had settled, Mrs. Williams sat at her desk, reflecting on the day's events. The school had asked her to meet with a counselor, and although she was reluctant, she knew it was necessary. The trust that had been broken couldn't just be fixed with an apology, but maybe it could be rebuilt with time and effort. She had learned that lesson the hard way, and for Lena, things slowly started to return to normal. The other kids at school moved on. The whispers faded, and life continued. She would never forget what happened, but she learned the importance of standing up for herself, of knowing that mistakes didn't define who she was. Her father, as intimidating as he seemed, was more than just a protector. He was a reminder that family was everything, that no matter how hard things got, they would always have each other's backs. That day, Lena realized how powerful love and support could be, and how, sometimes, the hardest moments could bring the greatest lessons. As the days passed, Mrs. Williams and Lena's father crossed paths in the halls, exchanging brief nods, but nothing more. The incident had left an indelible mark on both of their lives, but neither of them could ever truly forget it. The tension had subsided, but the lesson remained. Actions had consequences, and understanding the full picture before making decisions was crucial. In the end, everyone moved on, changed, but wiser for it. Lena would carry with her the knowledge that even in the toughest moments, there was always room for growth. And for Mrs. Williams, it was a reminder that being a teacher meant more than just managing a classroom. It was about understanding, empathy, and sometimes the courage to admit when you were wrong. As for the school, the event remained a lesson in its own right. It wasn't just about one girl or one teacher. It was about how a single action could ripple through lives, creating a chain of events that no one could predict. The aftermath was a reminder that life doesn't always go as planned, but what truly matters is how we respond to the unexpected. So it's mini